So, so this pre-lab lecture is for heart. Okay, so you will find that I have altered the lab schedule that I posted earlier because initially I thought we would talk about the blood vessels this coming week. Then I realized that talking about heart would be better before we talk about blood vessels. So I am sending everybody the new lab schedule. So first we will do the heart. We'll check cardiovascular phenomenon, and then later we can come to blood vessels and lymphatic system. Okay. So let's begin with heart, right? So for this week's lab, we'll only deal with chapter 27, that is the structure of the heart. We'll go through the anatomy of the heart, the external and the internal anatomy, and the blood flow through the heart and stuff. I also want you to note that we will not do chapter 28 because that part we will study in physiology about the EKG and interpretation and so on and so forth. So we will not touch that at all. Then chapter 29, which is part of your cardiovascular phenomenon, we'll do for next week. So right now, you are only going to, the material that I'm going to cover today is only relevant to chapter 27 in your manual. Okay. So first of all, we need to understand one main thing, and that is, we'll talk about these later also. The blood vessels, two main categories are there. One is the artery and one is the vein. Okay, why am I mentioning that before the heart? Because they have relevance to the heart, because the heart is the one that is pumping the blood, right? And the same blood is going to be flowing through your arteries or your veins. So how do you distinguish? The main characteristic of arteries is arteries take the blood away from the heart. A for away, A for artery. Remember it like that. Veins, on the other hand, they bring the blood to the heart. So basically, arteries take the blood from your heart and then go to different parts of your body. And because that blood that is coming through the heart, right, it is oxygenated, and the arteries basically take this oxygenated or pure form of blood to the all parts of the body, all the cells, and so they can get the oxygen and metabolize and so on. So when they engage in metabolism, metabolic activities, the resultant product is carbon dioxide. Now that carbon dioxide is taken by different set of blood vessels called the veins, and they bring the deoxygenated or impure dirty blood, and they bring it back to the heart circulates it, and then takes it to the lung, purifies, takes up the oxygen, again it goes through the arteries. And that is basically the fundamental concept in circulation, blood circulation. Okay, so this is where heart comes into picture, right? It is the central organ that is involved in circulation. So you have to remember this. There is one exception, of course, for this definition of artery and vein. We'll look at it, and that is the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein. We'll come to that in a minute. Okay, so among the objectives that are given on your manual, we will not do only one objective, and that is objective 5. We are not going to do a sheep heart dissection. However, I will demonstrate dissection, virtual dissection in this pre-lab presentation. So please go through that. It is really very nice. And I'm going to section through the human heart, and I will show you the necessary parts that I think you should remember. Okay. All right. So let us begin with the heart wall, right? And before I go into the dissection mode, I want you to basically look at the pictures that's on your book, right, in your manual, page 356, picture 1, right, figure 1. So basically this picture. And so what it is showing is how the heart wall is located, what you can see in the heart wall, right? So underneath that picture, actually, you also see the real heart. Okay, so that's how it's going to look. It's not very pretty, right? And sometimes people figuratively say, oh, she ripped my heart apart. And actually, it's very easy to do that in a way, because the heart is only small and it can fit in a fist of a human being. And so it's actually located like right next to your lungs, right? And so it's nicely tucked inside there. Okay. Now, the heart wall, right? Um, if you remember from your AP1 lectures, we have something called the mediastinum, right? So that's right in the center, right? So that is actually locating heart and the esophagus and stuff like that. So the central line like that. So heart is located exactly there. So it is flanked by the your lungs, right? And now you're going to, when you, let's say we open the heart, right? Or open your chest cavity. The first thing you will find is the pericardium, which is fibrous, actually fibrous pericardium, right? And then you're going to see parietal pericardium. Anytime you come across the word parietal, you can kind of assume it's the outermost or external layer, right? So you have parietal pericardium, and next to the parietal pericardium, you're going to see a little cavity, right? And it's a little, and that's called pericardial cavity. And next to the in the pericardial cavity, basically you're going to see a fluid called pericardial fluid, and it is kind of serous. Serous means no cells, just liquid with some proteins and particles like that, right? Similar to a serum. Um, then you, next to that is the serous pericardium. So you had the fibrous pericardium, and now you're going to have a serous pericardium. Okay. Now, then you're hitting the heart wall. Okay. Now the heart wall, you got to remember, it is made up of 3 layers. So the outer layer is called the epicardium, right? Which is also called the visceral pericardium. And then visceral usually means internal, right? So you have the visceral epicardium, and then you have the myocardium, which is the thick layer. So a lot of people describe heart as one big muscle because of the myocardium, because myocardium is really very thick. This actually, these layers are very nicely depicted in picture or figure 27.2. And so you have the epicardium, which is a visceral pericardium. Then you have the myocardium made up of cardiac myocytes. Okay. So cardiac myocytes, I hope you remember from last year or last semester, AP1, cardiac myocytes are different, little different from both your skeletal muscle and your smooth muscle, because they have, first of all, one unique feature, and that is called the intercalated discs. These are very important, and we'll refer to that during the physiology of the heart lectures, because those intercalated discs are very important for the electrical conductance of the heart. And without the electrical conductance, our heart won't beat, and we won't even function as human beings or biological organisms. Anyway, so that myocardium is your second layer. And then internal to the myocardium, you have the endocardium. So endocardium is the one that is like, very close to the interior most part of the heart. Okay, and endocardium is actually made of a whole lot of endothelial cells. Okay, now the heart is, before I go in again, go to the dissection part, I want to mention some of the terminology, right? So you have to understand, in the heart, there are a couple of categories of parts that you want to learn. First, the chambers, right? There are 4 chambers in the heart. You have a right atrium, right? So, and left atrium, and then right ventricle and the left ventricle. Basically, you have, I'm going to show you the model. This model you're going to actually see in your lab as well. When you come to lab on Monday or Tuesday, whenever. So basically, let me see. So I know this is a very big model of heart, but it's also very beautiful. So let's say I'm putting my heart like that, right? Oh, I have a very big heart. So this is your right atrium, this is your left atrium, and this is your this part, right? That is your right ventricle, this is your left ventricle. Okay. Now, if I, so usually heart is a little tilted towards the left like that, right? Not straight like that, right? And right, this red thing, right, like kind of arching, right, that is your aorta, which is the biggest artery in our body. And this part, that bending part, that is your aortic arch, right? And this aorta is the artery that takes the blood from the heart eventually and supplies to the rest of the body. Okay, we'll come to that in a minute. But now this conical part where the heart ends, right there, this is called the apex of the heart. Okay, so four chambers, right atrium, left atrium, together we call them atria in plural, right ventricle, left ventricle. Okay, now the blood flow, which is given in your book, figure 27.3, right? It is this picture here, right? And that is pretty clearly given there, right? So, but I'm going to show it here. I'm going to open the heart now, right? So you can see some of the structures better here. So this is your right atrium chamber, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Okay, now how does the blood flow happen, right? So this blue part, right, that is your superior vena cava. It's a big vein, right? And so it drains all the blood from the things that are above your heart. And then they have another vein that's coming from here. That's a very big vein, and that is your inferior vena cava. Okay, so blood is coming from all the parts of the body, then comes into the superior vena cava or to the inferior vena cava. Both of them bring the blood into the first chamber, right atrium. From the right atrium, blood is going to go through this valve called tricuspid valve and then to the right ventricle. Okay. Now I mentioned valve. So there are four valves that you're going to learn in the heart. Okay. We'll come to that. I'm going to list them in detail. So right atrium to right ventricle. From the right ventricle, right? You think it is going to parts of the body, another chamber. No, it is immediately going to be going into this part, this blue thing. That's a pulmonary trunk, right? So there is a special valve there called pulmonary semilunar valve. And through that valve, blood is going to go into that pulmonary trunk. Okay. That pulmonary trunk basically is going to go into pulmonary veins. These veins are going to take the blood from the right ventricle to the lung. Okay, now you have to remember this blood coming from superior and inferior vena cava is impure blood because it has the deoxygenated blood. So it just went into the right ventricle and then from there it's going directly into the lung. Lung purifies the blood, takes off the carbon dioxide in exchange for oxygen. Now, the oxygenated blood comes through the pulmonary artery, through this one, right? And it flows into your left atrium. Okay, so from the left atrium, blood goes through the bicuspid valve or mitral valve into the left ventricle. So left ventricle is the most important chamber in the heart, right? Because this is where everything rests. And so that is pumping, pumping, pumping. And that, when it gets that blood into the left ventricle, it is going to send it through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. Aorta then takes the blood to all parts of the body. So this blood flow is, like I said, very well explained or indicated in picture 7.3 in your book. So please go through. Okay. What else? All right. Now You may wonder, hey, wait a minute, if heart is pumping blood to everything else, where does the heart muscle and all the tissues of the heart, where do they get the blood? There is another type of circulation, and that's called coronary circulation, whereby the arteries and veins of the heart, coronary arteries and coronary veins, they are involved, right, in taking the purified blood, right, from the aorta, and they are basically supplying to the cardiac muscle. The coronary arteries, that's what it is doing. It's taking the blood and supplying back to the heart cardiac muscle. Okay. Same way, coronary veins are going to take the deoxygenated blood from different parts of the heart and then supply it back into the right atrium to be purified and so on. So that's one thing I want to mention specifically. Second thing I want to mention is, earlier on I told you arteries in general, right, they are taking the blood away from the heart and therefore they carry the oxygenated blood, which is true for most of the arteries. There is an exception, and that is the pulmonary artery, right? So pulmonary artery, right, it is bringing the blood from lung, um, sorry, pulmonary artery, right? It's actually taking the blood from the right ventricle to the lung, right? And therefore, that is the only artery. It's called an artery because it's going away from the heart, but it's going to the lung. But you got to remember, not all arteries carry oxygenated blood, and that exception is this pulmonary artery because it is taking deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle. So that is the only artery exceptional. It takes the deoxygenated blood right from the heart, but it is going only to a closed circuit to the lung. And same way, pulmonary veins are the exceptional veins because even though they are coming to the heart, they are bringing oxygenated blood, while all the other veins in our body usually carry deoxygenated blood. So please make sure that you understand that distinction. Okay. And then you will also see some grooves in different parts. So right now I'm only talking about the external things. We are going to go through some of the internal structures later, but you will see that if we actually put it like this, I hope you can remember your sulci from your brain anatomy, right? So even in the heart, you see some sulci. Sulci are little depression. So you can see your interventricular sulcus, and that is here, right? So you can see that little depression between two ventricle, and then there is an atrial sulcus, and that is between the atria and so on. Okay. And then the other thing is that I told you that the metabolic carbon dioxide and everything, right? The metabolic byproducts of the tissue, especially the tissue of the heart muscle and so on, though that is going to be collected by the blood and returned to the heart by great cardiac vein and several other veins, right? And all of them actually drain into a big empty chamber called coronary sinus, and that is actually located in the interatrial sulcus as well. Okay. And then now I want you to see one other structure here. So this is your aorta, right? And this is your pulmonary trunk. See that? Now this white thing, there is little muscular kind of fibrous thing, right, that attaches these two. It is called ligamentum arteriosum. Okay. And this part is very important because during fetal development, especially because as a fetus, right, the respiratory system, lungs are not really very well developed. And therefore, in order for that fetus to, fetus basically depends on the mother's respiratory system. And therefore, some of the circulatory mechanisms are not going to be as developed in the fetus as they are going to be after the baby is born. And so the ligamentum arteriosum actually is very important for that. We will study more about it in your circulatory system, especially during your blood vessel lecture. Okay. Like the last paragraph on page 359, basically it lists a lot of things that you should know. So please go through the pictures and the model when you come on Tuesday or Monday to the lab, and make sure you identify all these uh, parts. Basically, inferior vena cava, inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and coronary arteries, cardiac veins, and so on. So let's now move on to the interior of the heart. Okay. Now, first, I want you to know the four valves. Okay. Now, between the right atrium and the right ventricle is this valve, right? It's actually going to be this side, right? That is your tricuspid valve. And here you can see that, oh, you can't see it very well, but yeah. So it is actually, it has three different areas, lobes or something like that, right? And this is very important because it's going to open and close like that, right? And so because of that opening is important because that's where it's going to, the blood is going to use that valve opening to come into the um, right ventricle. So dysfunction of that valve, it's going to ruin the whole heart function, right? Because the blood, first of all, it has to be completely drained from this to this, because constantly inferior and superior vena cava are going to dump the blood. So you can't afford to have too much blood here, right? And so it has to be completely drained. On the other hand, it can't be open all the time either, right? So it has to be that function of that tricuspid valve is also very important. So now blood comes here. So that is one valve, right? Second valve is when the blood from the right ventricle moves to the pulmonary trunk. So that is, now it is cut, but let's imagine that there is a tube there, right? And that valve is called pulmonary semilunar valve, because it's sort of like a half moon shaped valve, right? And so there it goes. So that is the one that is going to go into the pulmonary arteries and going to the lung and so on. Now, once the blood gets purified in the lung, comes through the pulmonary vein, drains into the right atrium. Left atrium. From the left atrium, there is another valve there between the left atrium and the left ventricle, and that valve is called mitral valve or bicuspid valve. It's like two sort of lobes, right? That's the third valve. From the left ventricle, which the purified blood goes into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. So that's your fourth valve. So you have to remember all the four chambers of the heart and the four valves. Okay. So that is first thing you have to understand. Now let me mention the other parts of the heart. So these two are the atria, right? Upper chambers. So if we didn't have this, okay, but I can show it like this. So this part, right? The sort of like a wall between the atria, it's called the interatrial septum. Okay, it's a little relatively thin, because if you look at the wall between the ventricles, that is relatively thick. It's called interventricular septum. Okay, just a septum. Okay. Now I'm going to tilt it and I'm going to show a couple of things. Okay, from the right ventricle towards the right atrium towards the left atrium. So you see this little indentation, right? In the fetus, this is going to be actually a hole, right? So from the right atrium, the blood doesn't have to go, because, like I said, what is the point of putting it through the pulmonary cavity, pulmonary trunk, because lung is not developed, right? And therefore, in the fetus, blood will flow from the right atrium into the left atrium directly, and so there is a hole there. It used to be the hole in the fetus. That hole was called foramen ovale. Okay, after the baby is born, that hole closes. It's then now this indentation, which is the mark or the remnant of that foramen ovale, is now it's called fossa ovale. Remember from your anatomy AP1, foramen is actually a hole, fossa is like a little dent, and so now it remains as fossa ovale. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to see, that little thing, right? That is basically the opening of your coronary sinus that I told about, where the heart muscle, blood from heart muscle and so on, they come, it is taken by the vein and coming to the right atrium, right? And so that is where the opening for the coronary sinus is located. Okay. Now let's move on to other structures. Okay. Now you will see also, it's not very clear here, but I can show you a little bit here. Yeah, you see those indentations inside the right atrium, and so you'll see that in the left atrium also a little bit, right? And that is basically the muscle structure, some muscles in the in the atria, and they are called the pectinate muscles, right? So it's a wall in the atrium. It's lined with pectinate muscle. Okay. Now let's move on and say, so now you have the valve here, your tricuspid valve, and then you see these little cord, thread-like structures extending. So they are called chordae tendineae. So they are basically involved in closing and opening of the valve. So they're very, very important. And as you see, in the lower part, right, the chordae tendineae are attached to another little these things, these bulges. Basically, they are muscles called papillary muscles. And the papillary muscles are actually directly attached to the ventricular wall. Okay, this is very important because papillary muscles have to be very strong and highly regulated because they are going to pull the heartstring. Basically, that's what is happening, right? So, if you want to write romantic poetry, you can say, "Oh, you're pulling my heart muscle," right? Instead of heartstrings, you can say, "Oh, you're pulling my chordae tendineae." Right? And so basically the papillary muscles are going to pull the chordae tendineae whenever the valves are supposed to be open and close. Okay. So you want to remember the valves, right? Atrioventricular valves. You have to remember the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles. Okay. There's another structure you will see. These are like this columnar sort of like extensions and everything. They are present in the ventricles. These are called trabeculae corneae, right? Trabeculae corneae. And so you should be able to identify those as well. So this is your interventricular septum. What else is important here? Yeah, I think I mentioned all of those things. Okay. Yeah, so that takes care of all the anatomical structures of the heart. So actually you can also see in the posterior side of the heart, you can see some of the arteries and veins, but I'm going to show that in your anatomy virtual dissection. Okay, give me just 1 second. Okay, so I hope you can see the heart, right? This is how the human heart looks, right? So, so that is your superior vena cava, that is your aorta, and that is your pulmonary trunk, right? So you can see that superior vena cava, ascending aorta, We have not, I'm not showing the aortic arch, but that's how it's going to go and make that arch like that side actually. And then that is your pulmonary trunk. And so now this is your right auricle, basically right atrium and left atrium. Then that's right coronary artery. We'll come to a more detailed structure of that one in a minute. Coronary sulcus, like that little depression sort of thing, basically heart. That is the anterior interventricular sulcus. That's the apex of the heart. Okay, so let us do a dissection of this. So I'm basically cutting it, right? And let's see what we have uncovered here. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. Fossa ovalis. You see that little depression there? That is your fossa ovalis, because it used to be your foramen ovale when it was fetus, and that the inside one, that is the opening of the coronary sinus. That's the inferior vena cava. Okay, where it attaches to the right atrium, and so that is where your pectinate muscle would be, right? So in the atrial wall. Okay, now that is the atrioventricular valve. Basically, that's your tricuspid valve. Chordae tendineae, those thread-like structures that are extending from your right atrium into the left atrium, right atrium into the right ventricle. Those are the trabeculae carneae, coronary artery, pulmonary valve. Okay, that's basically pulmonary semilunar valve. So that is basically one that's taking the deoxygenated blood. Okay, all right. Now let us dissect that part. Okay, let's see what we have uncovered here. So now you see the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, so you can see the aorta now cut there, and so it is showing this, and then you can see the how the tricuspid is attaching the right atrium to the right ventricle, and so on. You already start to see the muscular area, the myocardium in the left ventricle as well. Now we are seeing more of the ventricular area. There you see the thick division between the ventricles. That is your interventricular septum, right? That's the myocardium of the right ventricle. That's a trabeculae carneae. You can see them much better here, right? And so then you have your cardiae tendineae, and then that is where your tricuspid valve would be. That's the aortic vestibule, myocardium of the left ventricle. So you can see the part of the heart wall, myocardium, and as you see, it's pretty thick. Yeah. So this is the problem, right? When let's say when people have cardiac problem and so on, one of the major incidents is you know myocardial infarction or something. And so then the heart has to pump more and more, and then what happens is a lot of times you will increase the thickness of this ventricular wall, myocardium, right? When that happens, then the heart has to pump even more, right? And so because of that, what is called hypertrophy, ventricular hypertrophy can occur. And so you increase the myocardial thing more and more, and then the left ventricle eventually loses function, because how much ever it pumps, you're not going to put enough blood to the rest of the body and so on. But we'll talk about it in the physiology lectures. Okay, let's go deeper in here. Okay, and what do we have? So you start to see the left atrioventricular wall. That is your bicuspid or the mitral valve, connecting your left atrium with your left ventricle. So you can see that very nicely. And that is your papillary muscles. Now you see the papillary muscle, right? That is going to connect your bicuspid to the left ventricle. Basically, you have bicuspid valve and then your cardiac tendineae, and then you're going to connect that to the papillary muscle. And that, like I said, papillary muscle is going to regulate the opening and closing of the bicuspid. Now I have opened the heart completely. So you see the right atrium, interatrial septum, so between the two atria. This is the left atrium, and that is for the opening of the pulmonary veins. So that one and that one. So the pulmonary trunk will go here and open into these two branches. That is the interventricular septum, membranous, right ventricle. That's the muscular interventricular septum, left ventricle. So I hope you can. So now this angle is actually anterior. We are only seeing from the front of the heart. Okay. Let's look at vasculature. This is where the coronary artery and stuff come, right? So let's see first. So you see the heart. This is from the anterior angle once again. So that is your aorta, superior vena cava, pulmonary trunk. You can always keep this as your hallmarks, right? So that is your right, basically this is your right atrium. And so that is your right atrial vein. You see that little V as a suffix, that usually means vein. If you see an A, that's an artery, right? And also here you can see, generally in the models, veins will be depicted in blue in order to show that it is not red, pure red blood, right? And so here also you can see, because actually the veins are a little bluish because the oxygen is low, and so you have deoxygenated blood, and therefore the veins look a little bit bluish. So you can see, so that is your right atrial vein, small cardiac vein, right? As opposed to great cardiac, we'll come to that in a minute. And then that is right marginal vein, right? This picture or this part of this video, you can actually compare to the pictures in in your book on page 360, right? So you can see the vein part, and then you can say, oh, this is what I saw in the real heart. Okay. Now, right anterior ventricular vein, right? And that is your great cardiac vein. Great cardiac vein is the one that is major coronary vein, and that is the one that's going to collect a lot of blood from your cardiac muscle and everything, and then put it into the coronary sinus later. Left anterior ventricular vein, left marginal vein. Okay. Now let us dissect that part. See what we got here. Okay, now we are seeing the arteries here, right? Atrial arteries, right? Coronary artery. So this is the coronary artery. Okay, this is the one that can get clogged up, and then people say, oh, I'm having a coronary problem. That is the one that's very important, right? Because from the because if your coronary artery is blocked, then what's happening? Even though you're getting blood pumped and everything, and then aorta basically supplies it to the coronary artery, it is unable to supply that vein because it's clogged up, and so it cannot supply the blood back to the cardiac muscle. So if you have a coronary artery problem, right, it's very likely you will have ischemia. Basically that part of the muscle, cardiac muscle, will not get enough blood supply, and so no oxygen, and that little tissue will die. So that coronary artery is very important. Then you have right anterior ventricular artery, right marginal artery, right conus artery, left marginal artery, lateral, and left coronary artery. Okay. All right. Let us dissect that part and see what we have here. Superior vena cava, aorta, pulmonary trunk, left atrium, right pulmonary veins, right? They're going to bring the blood back to the heart from the lung. Right border of the heart, right atrium, right auricle, inferior vena cava. You see that little opening? That's where the blood is going to come from the parts of the body that are inferior to the heart. Coronary sulcus, that little depression here. Right ventricle, anterior intraventricular sulcus again, left ventricle, apex of the heart. Okay, we'll do one more dissection here, and that is the posterior. This is very interesting also. It's always nice to move the heart around or the models around and see what are the structures that are not visible from the front. Okay, now this is the posterior or the backside of the heart, right? So what do we have here? That is your great cardiac vein. Like I said, you saw that in the anterior view as well. That's oblique, vein of the left atrium, left posterior ventricular vein, coronary sinus, as you see, that is your coronary sinus. That's going to be a little chamber, middle cardiac vein, right, posterior vein, and then the small cardiac vein. Okay, now let's make that, right? Left atrial artery, like coronary artery, right? So from the front, it comes into the back. Right posterior ventricular artery, posterior interventricular, left posterior circumflex branch of the left, okay, right, left marginal, and then coronary artery. Okay. So that is your left pulmonary vein, right? You saw it from the anterior angle. And that is your left atrium, left auricle, basically. Ascending aorta, pulmonary trunk, superior vena cava, right pulmonary vein, left atrium, inferior vena cava, right atrium, coronary sulcus, as you see, that's a little depression there, left ventricle, sulcus, again between the two ventricles, right ventricle, apex of the heart. Okay, so because this is recorded, you can always rewind and check all the spots and stuff that I'm showing, and make sure you compare these things with the both the model that you will see in the class on Monday or Tuesday, whenever your class is, and also check them or compare them with the pictures that are given in your lab manual. They're pretty clear, okay? And like I said, we will do the auscultation and the cardiovascular phenomenon, which should be a smaller lab the week after, okay? So I think that concludes uh, the thing, but I also want to show before we close, I'm going to bring this poster. So this picture is going to be very self-explanatory because it labels everything in big letters and everything. So yeah, the big heart, right? And then you can see the aortic arch, pulmonary trunk, left atrium, right atrium. So the chambers are pretty evident, right? And then other things are smaller things are all marked there. And then you can see in the second picture the valves, right? So it shows the pulmonary semilunar valve here, your tricuspid valve here, bicuspid or the mitral valve here, and then your aortic semilunar valve, right? And in addition to showing, of course, your uh, the right atrium, left atrium, and so on. So you'll see the ligamentum arteriosus here. And what else is there? You'll also see the left pulmonary veins and so on. Okay. And this one shows the location of the heart in the human body. So you can see how heart is kind of tilted, right? And then this one shows the circulatory system in which heart is playing a central role, like I said before, right? So you can see how blood is flowing from right atrium to right ventricle, and then from there it goes to the pulmonary artery, and then it goes and goes to the lung, and then deoxygenated blood is dumped in the lung, and it gets oxygenated, returns to left atrium, then goes to left ventricle. From there it goes to the aorta, and then it goes to all the parts of the body, right? And blood, from all the parts of the body, blood comes through the superior vena cava or the inferior vena cava into the right atrium again, right? And so thoracic, you have several areas of the aorta, and those regions, like it could be thoracic aorta that is going to uh, take the blood for all the thoracic organs. or it could be abdominal, thoracic aorta, as you see, thoracic aorta, or it could go to abdominal aorta, which is going to bring the blood to other areas of the body and so on. And when we come to the blood vessels, I will show you how the capillary system works, whereby you have a demarcation between the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood. Okay, but I will bring this chart also to class on Monday and on Tuesday, so you can have a look at it. All right, I think that concludes this pre-lab. Please watch it before you come to class.